be honest, I have 7 people. Never forgave and never will, not only for a single item, but for an extensive series of tree. They are fully aware of who they are and I am. 2. The reserved George Harrison, one of the Beatles, will always be remembered by the public for his serene, kind, and passionate attitude. However, that is just a portion of the unspoken tale. Bisson's nostalgic eyes and smile were a list of people he hated, from intimate band members to international music. A few are made fun of for their voices. Some are charged with utilizing spirituality as a theatrical ploy. Their tunes. Some of them were friends at one point who mocked or disregarded them. So who precisely arrived at George Harrison's shade list? Surprisingly, the last name was connected to the notorious white powder that the backstage scene in Hollywood. George, the birth date of Harrison was February 25, 1943. In Liverpool. Being raised in a working-class household, Harrison's passion for music was inherited, left his mother, and quickly disclosed innate ability. At 16, he dropped out of school, tool electrician apprentice, later going on tour with the Quarrymen in 1960. Nobody anticipated that this journey would make him a member of the Fab Four and guarantee his position in music. Past. On the stage, George Harrison was notable for his serious intent, his taciturn demeanor, garnering media attention. The Quiet Beatle is its moniker. That moniker became even more ingrained following one incident. A few days prior to the end appearance by the Beatles, on the Ed Sullivan display, Harrison developed a serious infection of the throat. The actor commanded total quiet until show. That evening wasn't just a historic debut, but in addition to the start of a silent, eerie image him throughout his career. However, silence didn't imply being obedient while on tour. George's quiet demeanor clashed with the more pronounced, louder energy of the other participants. Additionally, it was there that tensions started to simmer. Despite his development as a lyricist, Harrison was still only permitted to have 2 or 3 tracks on each album. The media nearly completely disregarded him. Every time any one of his tracks was removed or placed in Thebs, disappointment grew more intense. The feeling that one is not respected originated, not just within the band, but from the way he was handled by the music industry. These wounds eventually built up into intense animosity that eventually hardened into resentment spanning decades. Elvis, to start the breakup of a childhood with Presley Odell early in the 1950s, an apparently arbitrary man that would influence young people's lives. Harrison, George. As he passed a house on his bike, he heard Elvis Presley's voice. Hotel heartbreak. A few remarks only, but it like a mental burst of light. Of the adolescent from Liverpool. Following that, rock and roll wasn't limited to music. The pulse in question washes blood vessels. Harrison subsequently said, when I heard Elvis, I knew I would never be the same once more. When he was younger, in addition to the Beatles, Elvis had a big influence on Harrison. Presley, the young man's picture with raw vocals, a guitar, and a defiant for him. Swagger came to represent her music with the power to transform lives. However, more in the 1970s, more than 10 years later, Harrison's encounter with his idol at Last Homage started to fall apart, rather than the intrepid Elvis of Heat noticed an elderly man wearing a sparkling white jumps, flanked by backup vocalists who are female and trumpets booming. Everything encased in the glamour of the stage in Las Vegas. Following Harrison sighed to pals after the meeting. All I wanted to say to him was, put on some drop the backup wear pants, and a black tee. Go play with the trumpets and singing. It's okay, Mom. Just like you used Toto. As stated by one of the entourage, Elvis heard that comment. He was reported to have smiled icily and whispered to a neighbor, if he believes that I will resume playing intimate bars to appease someone, then he has no knowledge of Elvis Presley. From then on, a step back developed between Elvis and Harrison regarding Harrison. Remorse for a purity that had disappeared. Elvis felt irritated over being a small English child, chastised him while remained in control of the stage in Las Vegas. However, Elvis wasn't the only person to Harrison's principles. In the Beatles' Thimsfest, somebody who was formerly a creative rival sprang from a shared spirit, brother-in-arms yet to McCartney to adversary to the Beatles. Within the Fab Four, Paul McCartney and George Harrison were at first to discover one another. Initially, just 2 youngsters were traveling together. Bus, connecting by mutual appreciation of music. Together, they would sit and pass the themo of the instrument back and forth, practice chords, then work on their fingers till they weren't cooked. McCartney lovingly referred to Harrison as his younger sibling. However, that fraternity was quickly put to the test and broken by the light of the spotlight that they had jointly constructed. By 1967, with the publication of Sgt. Bandel's Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club praised Raz for a work of art, the predominant creative imprint of McCartney was evident. Paul then started making claims close to complete command, advancing Harrison's contrastus to the margins. Prior to in 1969, Harrison always found it difficult to be acknowledged as McCartney's equal. His songs were frequently ignored, causing intense annoyance in a songwriter who yearned for artistic autonomy. The Abbey Road incident was the height of the tension. Meetings in 1969. Harrison battled to protect his work, denying McCartney's proposed modifications. Things became so heated that Paul McCartney acknowledged, "The trouble, we've always believed that our tunes were superior than George's. However, they are currently at Harrison's shot, at least as good as ours. Back directly, I would prefer Willie. Compared to Paul McCartney, Weeks plays bass, that's the reality. Paul has my respect. He is an fantastic bassist, but occasionally he's simply too overwhelming. John Lennon and I would form a band when not with Paul, but Darly Day it's not. It has to do with musical guidance." In 1974, Harrison, in an interview with BBE Radio, states Harper still. "My guitar playing has been destroyed by Paul, but in spite of their arguments, Harrison acknowledged that there was an added connection between them. I simply know that, regardless of what we've experienced, there's something that connects us all the time." Harrison and McCartney might still wore the traditional mask of brotherhood, but with another insect made things much more bitter. 3. After becoming an idol, John Lennon a pain in the side. As the general public was fascinated by the competition between Lennon and as well as McCartney, another, more subdued combat took place. Boiling below the surface between John Lennon and George Harrison, their relationship started at a young age. Prior to the Beatles' rise to stardom, George used to appreciate Lennon's humor and inventiveness. However, that awe was progressively diminished by the imposing figure of Lennon and his respectful demeanor. As the group expanded, the power died among the participants. Even though Harrison's songwriting skills developed, he was frequently marginalized, and Lennon hardly concealed his lack of interest. At one point, when George introduced a fresh demonstration, Lennon simply shrugged and, "Well, it's okay, but it's not the Beatles, something I'd listen to." Latter years, the distance had grown. Lennon publicly disparaged George's spiritual travel, making fun of his love of Indian music and mystical. In a single recording session, George attempted to clarify the meaning. Lennon cut in behind a lyric, "Don't tell me about those Indians, please." Saints once more. George Harrison became more resentful of Lennon's coldness and lack of regard. The warm discussions had vanished. Their exchanges had turned into tour and far away. In subsequent interviews, Harrison acknowledged that Lennon might become even self-centered. Mine is his memoir. George largely left out John's aquinas more profound than any direct critique. When questioned why, he merely grinned, "And some things don't need to be mentioned." Despite Harrison's lamented Lennon's passing, but he never attempted to conceal the wounds or sugarcoat the past it had never recovered. However, his irritations weren't the only ones. The Beatles brothers, away from the band, the voice of another well-known artist inspired him. Up the wall. For George Harrison was Neil Young's father, couldn't stand. George Harrison was known as the silent Beatle, hardly ever displaying overt annoyance. However, in 1992, in a unique instance, he displayed a more pointed, more unyielding side while talking about a fellow performer while recording Conversion with Bob Geldof. When questioned regarding Neil Young, Harrison didn't think twice. "I don't like Neil Young. I detest it. Yes, I find it unbearable," he continued. There, he immediately pursued what he saw as the most significant defect. "What matters most, Ishi's tone. I enjoy a few of his tracks. However, I detest that voice more than I do mine." This was more than simply a passing remark. It struck squarely at the heart of the individuality of the artist. His voice and manner of performance. Harrison even imitated the unique guitar style of Neil Young's style in the studio there. "Then it's just laughable," he sneered. He performs I stare at the solo in the middle of a song. "What's it about?" I ask about Eric. In the same year, George was placed by fate. Neil Young and Harrison on the same stage at the 30th anniversary of Bobfest of Dylan. Numerous well-known artists came to pay tribute to Dylan. However, backstage, the environment between Harrison and Young was distinctly cool. George avoided contact, never making more than a couple seconds of eye contact. Neil Young was aware of it at the time. Music journalists reported Young had been aware of Harrison's tongue remarks. However, rather than snapping, Neil just give it up amidst the cameras. Harry remained cheerful and mentioned the Beatles with steadfast reverence. Everything was altered by them. "I will always be thankful they provided opportunities for everyone." When explicitly questioned regarding Harrison's stippering comments, Neil shrugged. "Everyone has the right to their own opinion. I didn't initially enjoy some articide them as well. But how things change with time. You notice stuff." When the time came that evening, on stage, Neil stood beside them while they sang. George grinning as though he had never heard a song before, and sang a word of caution. Harrison himself did not show up, though amiable. He also didn't publicly make headlining circumstances. However, they performed for the audience. Everyone was aware of the distance between them regarding Harrison. Occasionally, it wasn't only about the voice with one individual from the group that it went considerably deeper. As a result, often his gaze that individual was being the false prophet. Prophet in the eyes of George Harrison during the counterculture's peak movement when spiritual principles and peace were honored everywhere. George Harrison clung to an unwavering "I'd never give in" to what he perceived as deception. For Harrison, music and spirituality was not an analogous idea. It was necessary to walk those paths. In all honesty, Townsend Peter, whose lead guitarist was one of the greatest rock stars of the day, He was renowned for swinging his arms like a windmill, his booming playing on the guitar with his incorporation of religious elements into the Tommy, whose rock, opera, in public. Townsend advertised Maher Baba's lessons being about compassion, enlightenment, and tranquility. However, to Harrison, there was something underneath the grandiose phrases. Fake. During an interview with India in 1966 Today, Harrison shot straight at the picture of Towns' hand. Yes. Each time I've encountered him, he's been stoned talking trash. I don't believe he's sincere about anything that religious things, although Harrison Bones' faith was a religious attire for the performance wrong, lacking genuine inner illumination. He considered it to be a blemish and a betrayal of art. Regarding the culture he wished to preserve, an incident offstage increased the tension. Specifics. Eric had been discreetly assisted by Pete Townshend. Clapton goes after Harrison's Pattie Boyd, first spouse, influencing Clapton's Well Not Leela, a love song. Harrison never openly placed the blame on Townshend. It was difficult to comprehend the occurrence that left no trace. This dispute wasn't solely about guitar playing. Superior or who was more powerful. It was conflict between the holy and the superficial, halfway between deception and reality. In a musically brilliant universe where it would be easy for stage lighting to hide that George Harrison stayed at the center, resolved to speak up and pursue purity out, even though doing so might require facing someone of the most influential names in rock. Then, when British pop was dominating the charts, Harrison became acquainted with a new phenomenon. However, rather than being he was impressed by the extra baggage. 6. The Britpop frontman Liam Gallagher, or simply extra luggage for Oasis. In the heyday of British pop, Oasis was praised in the 1990s as the descendants of the Beatles. Name was a combination of respect and a huge shadow over any band from Britain. The general public wished for a symbolic relationship between two legends for generations. However, George Harrison had no interest. He was without excitement for the analogy. In 1996, when speaking with Harrison didn't work for independent radio news, refrain from discussing Liam Gallagher, the vocal lead singer of A Paradise. He appears quite outdated and kind of dumb. Then the direct hit arrived to Liam's position within the group. In my opinion, it's demonstrated by seeing the band, not with a microphone, in his hand. He's simply too much baggage. This was more than simply a personal attack. It was a rejection of the whole British pop excitement about Oasis. Additionally, to ensure his opinion wasn't misinterpreted in 1997, when speaking with Lev Francis, encapsulated everything in a single crisp line. They weren't particularly. For someone such as Liam, this was essentially a public event. Gallagher. Challenge, unable to remain silent, he retaliated on MTV News, escalating the argument and to a music-related headline. To still adore the Beatles, but in my opinion, he seems like a _clown to me. If I noticed, I would be honest with him. A good clown. Liam continued after that. He continued buy and sell to Harrison's discretion. He simply reads the documents, therefore he is the one who is truly out of make contact. After that, the distance between the generation of the Beatles as well as the British pop generation became more apparent than before. If fans had anticipated an unforgettable handshake. Between two famous Brits, Liam and Harrison transformed it into eryther. It was a public battle of words. However, not Harrison's conflicts all originated with conflicting egos or audacious statements, because one case was far more intricate. Combining musical disappointment and the drug's shadow. M7 John Elton Despised because of the cliched music and used drugs as a brush. In the news, George, Elton John and Harrison seemed to become companions together. They gave a performance, attended events and spent time together, branded by the media with ease. However, behind the courteous grins and cordial welcomes, but the truth was more sour. In reality, they weren't fond of one another. A lot. During an interview in 1976, Harrison expressed a startlingly direct viewpoint. The music of Elton John is something I've never given much thought. Every song has a sound the same. He wrote one good song, in my opinion, a long time ago. Naturally, his music is according to a formula. Add some lyrics, give it a shake with 4 chords. Additionally, you have another Elton John enormous struck. That remark wasn't merely light-hearted criticism, that was a severe wound that went right to the heart of a man in the prime of his profession. Interestingly, Elton never retaliated in public. Instead, years later, he even mentioned Harrison with deference. He was the Beatles' wise guy, had discovered something worth more than notoriety. Yes, in his autobiography, Elton disclosed a personal incident. At a celebration, in the midst of the beverage's hilarity, Harrison gave him a direct look and declared, "For God's sake, reduceth that marching powder." Throughout the whole space, only George had the audacity to say it like a co-worker. But as Anne truly worried, they never had a black or white. Harrison might have been Elton's music disappointed me, but Hestel held the man in high regard. Even Elton, following much criticism, recalled Harrison as an uncommon voice of sincerity, a person impervious to the phony Hollywood flattery. In an opulent society where acclaim was frequently measured seeking profit, Their tale was similar to an authentic scuff on a glossy surface, exposing a contradictory friendship, cold but kind, aloof but vicious, sincere, stupid. Have you ever pondered what's behind it all, that brilliant splendor? If this tale has opened your eyes from an alternative viewpoint, hit like so that we are inspired to present you additional heartfelt material. Show this video to everyone. Reminding people that love and sincerity is always valuable to maintain, even if it entails suffering loss. And remember to turn on and subscribe alerts to ensure you don't miss the next poignant tale. Post a comment to help spread the word. Your emotions, since occasionally your own tale could serve as motivation for someone.